Stephen Bishop here. Welcome back to Life's A Bish. Today we have a very special guest, my close personal friend, old pal, Harold Bronson, who was the co-creator of Rhino Records. And we have him here. And say hello, Harold.
Hello, Bish. Happy to be here. We're going to have fun today.
We're going to have fun talking about our favorite subject, British invasion.
Yes.
I know Harold's an expert at this. He's published books on British invasion. I was into folk music. I was crazy about folk music. I played my brother used to bring home. My brother's like 9 years older than me. He used to bring home, albums by the Limelighters, by the Kingston Trio, all these, all this folk music. I remember I was into Bobby Vinton for a while, but then out of nowhere, the Beatles came along on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, as I'm sure you did. And it blew my mind and blew a lot of other people's mind. And a lot of future songwriters and performers were kind of born from that night when we saw the Beatles. My stepfather was watching it. He was a creepy guy. He was just, look at those mop tops. He didn't like them. But I wound up going to buy their album, and I couldn't afford it because I was just, I was like 14, 15. And so I wound up buying this album called The Bugs. And so I knew all their songs by The Bugs, but nobody was very impressed that I was a big Bug fan. So so I wound up going back. I finally got to meet the Beatles, their first album, or I guess, I don't know, if VJ Records put out their first album. I'm not sure how that goes. Do you know?
Well, the Capitol record came out, but then very quickly the VJ record. And what's interesting is we're probably going to play I Want to Hold Your Hand, but when that, which was on Capitol, that was the first big single on Capitol. But a week later, only a week later, She Loves You, which was on Swan Records, charted. So,
Swan Records?
Right, so that's because originally Capitol Records, didn't think a British band, how are we going to sell that here? So they rejected the first few Beatles singles, so they came out on other labels.
VJ.
Also Tollie, Tollie, and Swan out of Philadelphia.
Swan?
Yeah.
So Brian Epstein must have done different deals.
No, it was EMI. They were signed to EMI Records in England. EMI, at a certain point a few years before, had bought Capitol Records in Hollywood.
Wow. Well, I should say, the first time I heard the Beatles, really, I'm not sure if it was the Ed Sullivan Show or if it was, I was a newspaper boy back then, and I was on my corner selling newspapers when a convertible pulled up. And there was a guy with a girl, and he was like, hey there, baby. And out of the radio, very loud, was I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. And I was like, wow, what is that? It just sounded like magic. It sounded like magic to me.
Well, so I was really super into baseball. And I was into, being a Dodger fan and a fan of contemporary, but something inside, I always loved history, and I would go back and read biographies of these older players like Red Schoendienst, the second baseman of the 1940 St. Louis Cardinals. But what was kind of interesting back in those days is nowadays you could see, YouTube and all kinds of documentaries, you could see footage, but back then rarely would you see footage of old baseball players. So, they were legendary, Hall of Fame and this and that.
Sure.
And, maybe you might see Babe Ruth.
Mickey Mantle.
Right, but, I'm talking way before that. But a lot of these older players, you would never see the footage. So you could read about them and hear how legendary they were and look at their statistics, but never really know what they were like as players. But anyway, so that kind of was receding as, and then really, I was aware of music and sometimes I would listen to it, but didn't really grab me until the Beatles.
The Beatles.
Now, the first I saw a picture of them, so I was in 8th grade. Keith Moran, who was a student, had a Beatles button. And I looked at these guys and I thought they all looked like Moe from the Three Stooges. Of course, there was the big buzz about Ed Sullivan, so I saw Ed Sullivan. I was interested, but it didn't really work for me. And the reason why I figured out later was because the TV, the speaker, was really small and not very good. And that was different than if you heard something off of radio and compressed and really... So on radio later it was like really exciting, but not initially when I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show.
I think one of the reasons why the Beatles were so awesome, and this is a weird thing, but so many of their records had cymbal. And there's Ringo playing shh, and the sound shh from the cymbals, and I was like, I think it's something I noticed years later, really. I didn't notice it at the time. And then their personalities, which, now you look at groups and where is your personality, buddy? Back then they were just so funny, so confident. Their press conferences, which when I was lucky to see some, they were hilarious. They captured everyone. And of course, we all know it was after the Kennedy assassination and the country needed to heal. And they were a big part of the healer program.
So, you made a very good point, is that aside from this really great music, it was their personalities and the humor. Now, if you had heard prior to them, if you heard the Beach Boys being interviewed or Elvis being interviewed, they were dull and uninteresting.
Serious.
And, of course, a big influence for the Beatles were the Goons, which was Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers.
Sure.
Right? And then also the music hall tradition, which in the U.S. kind of similar to vaudeville, but a lot of the comedians, singing in the pubs, everybody, there was a real comedy and spirit, and that's what the Beatles and the other English groups had.
Right.
That the American groups didn't have.
I think the rest of the Beatles kind of followed John Lennon's lead.
Yes.
Because John Lennon had a confidence that was amazing. Especially in Hard Day's Night. I fashioned my sense of humor from John Lennon in Hard Day's Night. He was so funny, and he was just so inventive, all the things he was doing and all the little scenes. Remember that one scene where he walks down the stairs and he runs into this actress or this woman who goes, "Oh, it's you." And he goes, "Yes, it is." And they had this little banter.
Yeah.
It was just, he had a confidence. Well, I think they all just got confident from John, and they're all so talented,
Yeah, well, anyway, you brought up a prime example. And, what happened is how part of that movie was written by Alan Owen, I think was his name. He followed them around for a couple of weeks. He hung with them, and like certain their quips and their style, he would write down and he integrated into the script. But the point I want to make, aside from the fact that even today, that's a funny movie.
It's a great movie.
To us Beatles fans, even though we know, years later you read about, what they were really like, and, just like everybody else, they could be angry, they could be this, they could be that. John Lennon had a lot of anger with him, and a lot of negative personality traits, like making fun of cripples and stuff like that.
He did.
But at the time you were Beatles fans sitting in the movie theater watching that movie, it was so seductive that years later, that's how you want them to be. That's the Beatles, and that's what they were like. And that's what you want them to be like.
John Lennon got very serious later on with Yoko, and everything was so heavy, and peace and all. I mean, it was great. He was always terrific, but.
By the way, one last thing again, when you're young, a lot of these things you don't see, but when early on in the train compartment with the old man and the other people, and then Lennon picks up the bottle
of Coke bottle.
Coke, and he sniffs it. Well, when you're 13, 14,
we didn't
you
know.
don't know what that means.
We didn't know what it meant.
So maybe like the third or fourth time I saw it in my 20s, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's funny. That's really
he's sniffing
clever.
Coke,
Right.
It was like they were already very experienced with drugs and all that stuff. Not to say that that's a good thing, but they were they played in Hamburg every night and for months, and they saw it all early on.
Yeah. So as it relates to some of the early songs like "She Loves You," "I Want to Hold Your Hand," they were so exciting. They were upbeat. They were ebullient. It was like a joy to be alive, being a Beatle fan and listening to those records. And as music became more sophisticated, like into the 70s and 80s and beyond, it lost a lot of that fun spirit.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't totally limited to the Beatles, because when you think about Little Richard's records are fun. Or,
Rip It Up.
Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire, a lot of outrageous stuff.
50s.
So, but again, one of the problems as a music fan was, I'm not saying I didn't like music from the 70s or 80s, I'm just saying it was different and it was serious, and it really lost that innocence and naivete and that fun spirit.
I say Elvis Presley you should include in that too, because he had a lot of songs like, A Little Less Conversation, and all those songs.
Well, yeah, sure.
I mean, he was great. Well, let's hear something. Let's hear I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Okay.